What happens when one of hip-hop's most laid-back artists reaches his breaking point on live television? Tonight, we're diving into the explosive moment that had everyone talking, when Wiz Khalifa walked off Jimmy Kimmel's show after what started as a routine interview turned into something nobody saw coming. The tension was thick, the questions got personal, and by the end, one of the biggest names in music had enough. But before we get into exactly what went down in that studio, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because this story is going to show you a side of both these personalities you've never seen before. The studio lights were blazing as usual that Tuesday night, casting their familiar warm glow across the iconic late-night set. Jimmy Kimmel sat behind his desk, shuffling through his note cards with that trademark grin plastered across his face. The audience was buzzing with anticipation, knowing they were about to witness something special. Behind the scenes, producers were scurrying around making final adjustments, cameramen were checking their angles, and the makeup team was putting finishing touches on both host and guest. Wiz Khalifa, dressed in his signature black and yellow ensemble, complete with gold, chains catching the studio lights, walked out to thunderous applause. His usual cool demeanor was intact as he waved to the crowd with both hands, that characteristic laid-back smile spreading across his face. He moved with the confidence of someone who had done this dance 1,000 times before, taking his seat in the guest chair and adjusting his jewelry as the applause died down. The interview started innocently enough, with Jimmy diving into the typical celebrity small talk that late-night audiences had come to expect. They discussed Wiz's latest album, breaking down the creative process behind some of the tracks, and Jimmy even attempted to rap along to one of the hooks, much to the audience's delight and Wiz's amusement. The rapper seemed genuinely relaxed, leaning back in his chair with that characteristic smile, occasionally chuckling at Jimmy's attempts at humor and nodding along when the host made references to his music. They moved on to discuss his upcoming tour dates, with Jimmy making jokes about different cities and asking about Wiz's favorite venues to perform at. The conversation flowed naturally, with Wiz sharing stories about his fans and some of the wild experiences he had encountered on the road. The audience was eating it up, laughing at all the right moments, and everything seemed to be flowing smoothly according to the typical late-night interview formula. Jimmy then shifted to discussing Wiz's social media presence, bringing up some of his more viral posts and asking about his relationship with his fans online. This seemed like safe territory, and Wiz opened up about how much he enjoyed connecting with people through social platforms, talking about the positive messages he received and how music brought people together from all walks of life. The conversations had that easy, comfortable rhythm that makes for good television. But then something shifted in Jimmy's demeanor, subtle at first but noticeable to anyone paying close attention. His smile remained, but there was something different behind his eyes, a kind of calculated look that suggested he was building towards something. His questions became more pointed, more personal, moving away from the typical promotional material that guests usually came on to discuss. The change was gradual enough that the audience didn't immediately pick up on it, but Wiz seemed to sense something was different. Jimmy started pressing about Wiz's past relationships, bringing up names that hadn't been in the headlines for years. He framed these questions as casual curiosity, wrapping them in that fake late-night show charm, but there was an edge to them that made the atmosphere in the studio begin to change. The rapper's body language began to shift subtly, his posture becoming slightly more rigid, his responses shorter and more measured than they had been just moments before. The host seemed to notice this change, and instead of reading the room and backing off like any decent interviewer would, he appeared to take it as encouragement to dig deeper. He brought up old controversies that most people had forgotten about, incidents from years past that had nothing to do with Wiz's current projects or anything he was there to promote. These weren't the kind of questions that came from genuine journalistic curiosity. They felt more like tabloid fishing expeditions disguised as late-night banter. Wiz tried to handle it with grace at first, deflecting some of the more invasive questions with humor and attempting to steer the conversation back to his music and upcoming projects. He made jokes about how the media liked to blow things out of proportion and tried to keep the mood light, but you could see in his eyes that he was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the direction things were heading. Jimmy wasn't taking the hint. If anything, he seemed emboldened by Wiz's attempts to deflect, interpreting them as an opportunity to push even harder. He had clearly done his research, or maybe his writers had spent hours digging through old tabloid stories and gossip sites, because he kept bringing up incidents and situations that Wiz had clearly moved on from long ago. Each question seemed designed to provoke rather than inform, to create drama rather than entertainment. The audience began to sense the shift in energy. The laughter became more sporadic, more uncertain. Some people in the crowd looked visibly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and exchanging glances with each other. The applause became more muted, and you could feel the collective mood of the room changing from excited anticipation to awkward tension. Wiz's jaw began to tighten with each increasingly personal question. You could see him fighting to maintain his composure, his hands gripping the arms of his chair slightly tighter than before. His responses became even more clipped, and that easy smile that had characterized the beginning of the interview was starting to fade. He was clearly trying to be professional, to get through the segment without causing a scene, but Jimmy seemed determined to push him past his breaking point. The rapper made several attempts to redirect the conversation, mentioning his music, his fans, his positive message, anything to get away from the personal attacks disguised as interview questions. But every time he tried to move the discussion to safer ground, Jimmy would circle back with another invasive question, another probe into his private life, another attempt to get a reaction that would make for viral television. You could see the internal struggle playing out on Wiz's face. This was someone who had built his career on being laid back, on promoting positivity and good vibes, but he was being systematically provoked by someone who was supposed to be hosting him as a guest. The professional in him wanted to finish the interview and maintain his reputation, but the human being in him was clearly reaching his limit with the disrespect he was being shown. The breaking point came when Jimmy decided to cross the line that should never be crossed. With that same fake smile still stretched across his face, he leaned forward and made a comment that cut straight to the heart of what mattered most to Wiz. He brought up the rapper's son directly, making what he probably thought was a clever joke about co-parenting and custody arrangements. But what came out of his mouth was nothing short of a personal attack, disguised as comedy. The studio fell completely silent except for the low hum of the cameras and the barely audible whisper of the air conditioning system. Even the audience members who had been uncomfortable before now looked genuinely shocked. This wasn't edgy, late-night humor. This was a host using his platform to humiliate a guest on national television. The camera operators kept rolling, knowing they were capturing something that would be talked about for years to come. Wiz's entire demeanor changed in that instant. The laid-back artist who had walked out to cheers just minutes earlier was gone, completely transformed. His eyes narrowed, his jaw set, and every muscle in his body seemed to tense at once. The easygoing persona that had made him famous wasn't just an act. It was genuinely who he was. But everyone has their limits, and Jimmy had just found his. He leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to a level that was barely above a whisper, but somehow carried more weight than if he had been shouting. When he spoke, every word was measured, controlled, and loaded with the kind of intensity that made everyone in the studio realize they were witnessing something unprecedented. The cameras caught every micro-expression on his face as he processed what had just been said. The hurt, The anger and the disbelief that someone would go that far for the sake of entertainment. Jimmy, perhaps finally realizing he had ventured into territory that no decent human being should explore, tried to backtrack. With that nervous laugh that hosts do when they know they have completely misread the room, he attempted to frame his comment as just a joke, as if calling it comedy could somehow erase the damage he had just inflicted. But his voice had a tremor in it now, and that confident smile was starting to crack around the edges. Wiz slowly stood, up from his chair, his movements deliberate and controlled, like someone who was using every ounce of his self-discipline to maintain his composure. The audience held its collective breath, unsure of what was about to happen next. Some people in the front rows actually leaned back in their seats, as if they could feel the tension radiating from the stage. The rapper looked directly at Jimmy, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had been pushed far beyond his breaking point. He told the host exactly what he thought about someone who would use a child as material for cheap laughs, someone who would invite a guest onto their show only to ambush them with personal attacks. His words were measured but devastating, each sentence hitting like a perfectly aimed punch. Jimmy tried to interrupt, to explain that it was all just part of the show, that he was just trying to be entertaining. But Wiz cut him off with a look that could have frozen fire. The host's attempts at damage control only made things worse, because they revealed that he still didn't understand the gravity of what he had done. He was treating this like a minor misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with his usual charm. But this had gone far beyond anything that could be fixed with a fake apology. The rapper's voice rose slightly, not to a shout, but to a level that ensured everyone in the studio could hear exactly what he was saying. He talked about respect, about the difference between entertainment and cruelty, about what it meant to be a decent human being. His words weren't just directed at Jimmy. They were a masterclass in how to maintain your dignity while calling out someone who had completely lost theirs. The studio audience was completely silent now, watching this unfold like witnesses to a car accident. Some people had their phones out, trying to capture this moment that they knew would be replaying across social media within hours. The producers behind the cameras were probably having panic attacks, knowing that this was either going to be the most viral moment in late-night television history or a complete disaster that would require massive damage control. Jimmy's face had gone from confident to concerned to something approaching panic. His usual quick wit had completely abandoned him, and he was stumbling over his words as he tried to find some way to salvage the situation. But everything he said only made things worse, because he was still treating this like a comedy bit gone wrong, instead of recognizing that he had genuinely hurt someone who had come on his show in good faith. Wiz took a step back from his chair, and you could see him making a decision in real time. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every guest who had ever been disrespected on television, every person who had been made the butt of a joke they never consented to, every individual who had been treated as content rather than as a human being. His voice became stronger, more assured, as he found his footing in this moment that nobody had prepared him for. The rapper began to speak about his son, not because Jimmy had asked, but because he wanted to set the record straight about what kind of father he was, and what kind of person would use a child as a comedy material. His words were powerful and personal, revealing a depth of emotion that late-night television rarely captured. This wasn't rehearsed, this wasn't scripted, this was raw human experience playing out in front of millions of viewers. Jimmy made one final attempt to regain control of the situation, reaching for his usual bag of tricks. But Wiz had heard enough. The look he gave the host could have melted steel, and when he spoke next, his words carried the finality of someone who had made up their mind about exactly what was going to happen next. Wiz straightened his chains and looked directly into the camera, bypassing Jimmy entirely as if the host had ceased to exist. When he spoke, it was with the calm authority of someone who had found their moral center in the middle of chaos. He addressed the audience at home, the people who had supported his music and his message over the years, telling them that they deserved better than watching someone get torn down for entertainment. His words cut through the studio like a blade, explaining that real entertainment didn't require humiliating guests or using their families as punchlines. He talked about the difference between comedy and cruelty, between pushing boundaries and crossing lines that should never be crossed. Every sentence was delivered with precision, and you could see Jimmy shrinking behind his desk with each word. The host made one desperate attempt to interrupt, to assert his authority in his own studio, but Wiz held up a hand that somehow commanded more respect than all of Jimmy's bluster. The rapper continued speaking, his voice never rising, but somehow filling every corner of the room. He explained that he had come here to talk about his music, to connect with fans, to spread positivity. But instead, he had been treated like a target in someone else's twisted game. Jimmy's face was flushed now, a mixture of embarrassment and anger at losing control of his own show. He tried to make another joke, something about artists being too sensitive. But the words died in his throat when he saw the look Wiz gave him. The audience had turned completely against the host now, and you could feel their disapproval radiating from the seats like heat from a fire. Wiz began walking toward the edge of the stage, but he wasn't running away or storming off in anger. His movements were deliberate, dignified, like someone who had made a conscious choice about how this story would end. He paused at the top of the stairs that led down to the audience, turning back to face Jimmy one final time. What he said next would be quoted and reshared millions of times over the following days. He told Jimmy that being a host meant being responsible for the energy you put into the world, that having a platform was a privilege that came with the obligation to treat people with basic human decency. His voice carried the weight of someone who had built their career on positivity but had been forced to draw a line in the sand. Jimmy tried one last time to salvage his reputation, standing up behind his desk and attempting to make light of the situation. He called out to Wiz, trying to make it seem like this was all part of some elaborate bit, but his voice cracked with desperation. The rapper didn't even turn around, just kept walking down those stairs with his head held high. The audience began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to a thunderous ovation that drowned out whatever Jimmy was trying to say. People were standing now, showing their support for someone who had refused to be disrespected on national television. The cameras captured it all. The empty guest chair, Jimmy standing alone behind his desk, and Wiz walking through the audience, like he was leaving his own concert. As he made his way toward the exit, Wiz stopped to shake hands with audience members, to smile and take pictures, showing that his issue wasn't with the people who had come to be entertained, but with the person who had betrayed the trust that guests place in their hosts. His demeanor was completely transformed from the tense, angry person he had been just moments before. This was the real Wiz Khalifa, the person his fans knew and loved. Jimmy was left standing on his stage, trying to make jokes to an audience that was no longer listening, desperately attempting to regain control of a situation that had completely slipped away from him. His writers were probably frantically scribbling notes, trying to figure out how to salvage the rest of the show, but the damage was done. The moment had exposed something ugly about late-night television, about the way guests were sometimes treated as content rather than people. The rapper reached the exit doors and paused one final time, not to look back at Jimmy, but to wave to the audience members who were still applauding his decision to stand up for himself. In that gesture, there was grace, dignity, and a reminder that real strength sometimes means knowing when to walk away. The doors closed behind him with a soft click that somehow seemed louder than all the chaos that had preceded it. Jimmy was left alone on his stage, trying to make sense of what had just happened, while the audience slowly settled back into their seats. The show would go on, But everyone in that studio knew they had witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come. The cameras kept rolling, capturing Jimmy's awkward attempts to transition to his next segment. But the energy in the room had completely shifted. What had started as a routine late-night interview had become a masterclass in dignity, respect, and knowing your worth. If you enjoyed this breakdown of one of the most explosive moments in late-night television history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think really drives someone to their breaking point like this.